Doctor humiliates black nurse in front of patient, unaware of who the patient really is. Sarah Johnson had always dreamed of becoming a nurse. Growing up in the small town of Macon, Georgia, she'd witnessed firsthand the impact that compassionate healthcare workers could have on a community. Her mother, a home health aide, had instilled in her a deep respect for the medical profession and a desire to help others. Despite facing numerous obstacles as a young black woman in the South, Sarah persevered, driven by an unwavering determination to make a difference in people's lives. Sarah's journey hadn't been easy. She'd worked multiple jobs to put herself through nursing school, studying late into the night, and sacrificing her social life to maintain her stellar grades. Her hard work paid off when she was accepted into the prestigious nursing program at Emory University. There, she thrived, absorbing knowledge like a sponge and impressing her instructors with her dedication and natural aptitude for patient care. Upon graduating with honors, Sarah had her pick of job offers. She chose Piedmont Atlanta Hospital, drawn by its reputation for excellence and its diverse patient population. Now, at 28 years old, Sarah was 3 years into her career and had quickly gained a reputation as one of the most dedicated and skilled nurses on staff. Patients adored her gentle touch and reassuring smile, while most of her colleagues respected her sharp mind and unwavering work ethic. However, not everyone appreciated Sarah's talents and dedication. Dr. William Hartley, a prominent cardiologist at Piedmont Atlanta, was one such person. At 55, he'd been practicing medicine for nearly 3 decades and had developed a sense of superiority that often manifested as condescension towards those he deemed beneath him, particularly nurses and other support staff. Dr. Hartley came from old money, his family name adorning buildings across Atlanta. He'd attended the finest schools, never wanting for anything, and had grown accustomed to a world that bent to his will. His surgical skills were undeniable, but his interpersonal skills left much to be desired. Nurses dreaded being assigned to his service, knowing they'd face a day of belittling comments and impossible demands. On a busy Tuesday morning, Sarah was assisting Dr. Hartley with a new patient, Mr. George Thompson. Mr. Thompson, a distinguished-looking African-American man in his early 70s, had been admitted with chest pains and was awaiting diagnosis. As Sarah entered the room with Mr. Thompson's chart, Dr. Hartley barely glanced up from his phone. "Took you long enough," he muttered, snatching the chart from her hands. Sarah felt a familiar pang of frustration, but maintained her professional composure. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," Sarah said warmly, turning to the patient with a smile. "How are you feeling today?" Before Mr. Thompson could respond, Dr. Hartley cut in. "I'll ask the questions, Nurse Johnson. Why don't you make yourself useful and check his vitals?" Sarah nodded, moving to take Mr. Thompson's blood pressure. As she worked, Dr. Hartley began questioning the patient about his symptoms, frequently interrupting and speaking over him. Sarah couldn't help but notice Mr. Thompson's growing frustration, his answers becoming shorter and his brow furrowing. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah interjected gently, "have you experienced any shortness of breath along with the chest pain? Sometimes patients don't realize it's related." Dr. Hartley whirled on her, his face flushing with anger. "Did I ask for your input, Nurse Johnson? Know your place and let the real medical professionals handle this." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she held her head high. "I apologize, Dr. Hartley. I was simply trying to gather all relevant information for the patient's care." "Well, don't," Dr. Hartley snapped. "Your job is to follow orders, not play doctor. Maybe if you spent less time trying to impress everyone and more time doing your actual job, you wouldn't make so many mistakes." Mr. Thompson's eyes widened at the doctor's outburst, darting between Sarah and Dr. Hartley with a mix of shock and disapproval. "Now," Dr. Hartley continued, turning back to Mr. Thompson with a forced smile, "let's continue without any further interruptions from the help, shall we?" As the examination proceeded, Sarah focused on her tasks, fighting back tears of anger and frustration. She'd encountered prejudice before. Growing up in Georgia, it was an unfortunate fact of life, but never so blatantly in a professional setting. She thought of all the sacrifices she'd made to get here, all the nights she'd stayed up late studying, all the doubters she'd proved wrong. And now, to be treated like this in front of a patient? Mr. Thompson kept glancing at her sympathetically, but Sarah avoided eye contact, not wanting to make the situation worse. She could feel the weight of years of microaggressions and dismissed concerns pressing down on her, threatening to crush her spirit. Finally, Dr. Hartley finished his examination. "Well, Mr. Thompson, based on your symptoms and history, I believe we're dealing with angina. We'll run some tests to confirm, but I'm confident in my diagnosis. Do you have any questions?" Mr. Thompson cleared his throat, sitting up straighter in his bed. "Yes, doctor, I do have a question. Do you always treat your nursing staff with such disrespect, or is Nurse Johnson a special case?" The room fell silent. Dr. Hartley blinked, taken aback by the patient's directness. I beg your pardon?" "You heard me," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice firm but calm. "I've been in this hospital for less than an hour, and I've witnessed you belittle, demean, and humiliate this young woman multiple times. Is this standard practice at Piedmont Atlanta?" Sarah froze, her eyes wide as she looked between Mr. Thompson and Dr. Hartley. The doctor's face had gone from red to pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Mr. Thompson," Dr. Hartley finally managed, "I assure you that I have the utmost respect for our nursing staff. Perhaps you misunderstood." "I didn't misunderstand anything," Mr. Thompson interrupted. "What I saw was a clear case of unprofessional behavior, possibly motivated by racial prejudice, and as a member of the hospital's board of directors, I find that completely unacceptable." The silence that fell over the room was deafening. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she processed Mr. Thompson's words. Dr. Hartley looked as though he might faint. I'm sorry, there must be some mistake," Dr. Hartley stammered. Mr. Thompson reached for his wallet on the bedside table, pulling out a business card and handing it to the stunned doctor. "No mistake, Dr. Hartley. George Thompson, newly appointed to the board of directors at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital. I was planning to tour the facilities incognito to get a true sense of day-to-day operations, but it seems I've already learned quite a bit." As the implications of Mr. Thompson's revelation sank in, Sarah felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Relief that someone had finally witnessed and called out Dr. Hartley's behavior, anxiety about what this might mean for her job, and a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this could be the catalyst for real change. In the immediate aftermath of Mr. Thompson's revelation, the atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. Dr. Hartley's demeanor changed dramatically, the arrogant dismissiveness replaced by a nervous, ingratiating smile. "Mr. Thompson, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am for this misunderstanding," Dr. Hartley began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "I assure you, this is not at all representative of how we operate at Piedmont Atlanta. Nurse Johnson is a valued member of our team, and I was simply trying to maintain efficiency in a high-pressure environment." Sarah fought the urge to roll her eyes at the doctor's transparent attempt to save face. She'd seen this behavior before, not just from Dr. Hartley, but from others in positions of power when confronted with their own prejudice. The quick pivot from disdain to fawning respect was almost dizzying. Mr. Thompson, however, was having none of it. His eyes, sharp and discerning, never left Dr. Hartley's face as he spoke. "Dr. Hartley, let's be clear. There was no misunderstanding. Your behavior was unprofessional, disrespectful, and potentially discriminatory. This is not a matter to be swept under the rug with hollow apologies." Turning to Sarah, Mr. Thompson's expression softened. "Nurse Johnson, I want to commend you for your professionalism in the face of such treatment. Would you be willing to speak with me privately about your experiences here at the hospital?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at Dr. Hartley, who looked as though he might burst a blood vessel. Her mind raced, weighing the potential consequences. Speaking out could put a target on her back, make her life at work even more difficult. But staying silent, hadn't that allowed this behavior to continue for so long? I'm not sure that would be appropriate, Mr. Thompson," Sarah said carefully. "I don't want to cause any trouble." "You wouldn't be causing trouble, my dear," Mr. Thompson assured her, his voice gentle but firm. "You'd be helping us address a serious issue that affects patient care and staff morale. Your insights could be invaluable." Before Sarah could respond, Dr. Hartley interjected, his voice strained. "Mr. Thompson, while I appreciate your concern, I really must insist that we focus on your medical care. Perhaps we could discuss any administrative matters at a more appropriate time." Mr. Thompson fixed the doctor with a steely gaze. "Dr. Hartley, I believe it would be best if you excused yourself from my care. I'll be requesting a different physician to oversee my treatment." The color drained from Dr. Hartley's face. But sir, I'm the head of cardiology. I assure you, you won't find a more qualified." "I'm sure the hospital has other capable cardiologists," Mr. Thompson interrupted. "Now, if you'll excuse us, I'd like to speak with Nurse Johnson privately." Defeated, Dr. Hartley nodded stiffly and left the room, closing the door behind him with a bit more force than necessary. As soon as he was gone, Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Mr. Thompson gestured for Sarah to take a seat beside his bed. "Now, Nurse Johnson, please tell me, was this an isolated incident, or have you experienced similar treatment before?" Sarah took a deep breath, weighing her words carefully. She thought of all the times she'd bitten her tongue, all the indignities she'd swallowed for the sake of keeping the peace. But she also thought of her mother's words spoken so often during her childhood. "Your silence won't protect you, baby. Sometimes you gotta speak up to make things right." "Mr. Thompson," Sarah began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I appreciate your concern, but I don't want to jeopardize my position here. Dr. Hartley is a highly respected physician, and my word against his would carry a great deal of weight with me and the rest of the board," Mr. Thompson finished for her. "Sarah, may I call you Sarah? I understand your hesitation, but change can only happen when brave individuals are willing to speak up. Your experience today is symptomatic of a larger problem, one that affects not just you, but potentially many others in similar positions." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as the emotions she'd been suppressing finally broke through. It's not always as blatant as what you saw today," she admitted. "But there's a pervasive attitude among some of the older doctors, especially towards younger nurses, and particularly nurses of color. We're often dismissed, our input ignored, and our skills questioned, regardless of our qualifications or experience." As Sarah spoke, the floodgates opened. She told Mr. Thompson about the countless times she'd noticed symptoms or potential drug interactions that were brushed off by certain doctors, only to be proven right later. She shared stories of being mistaken for janitorial staff, despite wearing her nurse's uniform. She described the exhaustion of constantly having to prove herself, of working twice as hard for half the recognition. "The worst part," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, "is that it affects patient care. When nurses are afraid to speak up, when our observations are dismissed, patients suffer. I've seen it happen, Mr. Thompson, and every time, it breaks my heart." Mr. Thompson listened intently, his face a mixture of sympathy and determination. When Sarah finished speaking, he reached out and patted her hand gently. "Thank you for your honesty, Sarah. I want you to know that your courage in speaking up will not go unnoticed or unappreciated. Now, I'd like to hear more about your experiences here at Piedmont Atlanta, both positive and negative. Your perspective could be instrumental in helping us create a more equitable and respectful working environment for all our staff." For the next hour, Sarah shared her experiences with Mr. Thompson. She told him about the everyday microaggressions she faced, the constant need to prove herself despite her excellent record, and the toll it took on her mental health and job satisfaction. But she also spoke of the colleagues who supported her, the patients whose lives she'd touched, and her unwavering passion for nursing despite the challenges. As their conversation drew to a close, Mr. Thompson looked at Sarah with a mix of admiration and determination. "Sarah, I want to thank you for your candor and your dedication to your profession. I promise you, your words will not fall on deaf ears. Changes will be made, starting today." Just then, there was a knock at the door. Dr. Lisa Chen, another cardiologist at the hospital, entered the room. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Dr. Chen. I've been asked to take over your care. How are you feeling?" Mr. Thompson smiled warmly. "Much better now, Dr. Chen. Thank you. Nurse Johnson has been taking excellent care of me." As Dr. Chen began her examination, Sarah excused herself from the room, her mind reeling from the events of the morning. She couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, real change was on the horizon. But as she walked down the hallway, Sarah also felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. She'd spoken up, finally given voice to the frustrations she'd been carrying for so long. But what would the consequences be? Would Dr. Hartley retaliate? Would her colleagues ostracize her? As she returned to her duties, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her world was about to change dramatically, for better or for worse. In the days following the incident with Dr. Hartley, Sarah noticed a subtle shift in the hospital's atmosphere. Whispers and curious glances followed her through the corridors, and she overheard fragments of conversations about a big shakeup coming from the board level. Some of her colleagues were supportive, offering quiet words of encouragement or a squeeze of the hand as they passed in the hallway. Others seemed wary, as if afraid that associating with her might put them in the crosshairs of whatever storm was brewing. Dr. Hartley was conspicuously absent, rumored to be on a sudden, personal leave. Sarah couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and guilt at his absence. Relief to be free from his constant belittling, but guilt at the thought that she might have ended someone's career, regardless of how deserved it might be. A week after Mr. Thompson's visit, all staff members received an email announcing a mandatory hospital-wide meeting. The message was vague, mentioning only that important policy changes would be discussed. Speculation ran wild, with theories ranging from mass layoffs to a complete restructuring of the hospital administration. On the day of the meeting, Sarah arrived early, finding a seat near the back of the packed auditorium. She watched as her colleagues filed in, a mix of excitement and apprehension filling the air. She noticed Dr. Chen give her a reassuring smile from across the room, but many others averted their eyes, as if looking at her directly might somehow implicate them in whatever was about to unfold. As the room settled, the hospital's CEO, Dr. Amanda Foster, took the stage alongside Mr. Thompson and several other board members. The murmur of conversation died down as Dr. Foster approached the microphone, her expression serious but not unkind. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for your attendance today," Dr. Foster began, her voice clear and steady. "We've called this meeting to address some serious concerns that have been brought to our attention regarding the working environment here at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital." A hush fell over the room as Dr. Foster continued, her words carefully measured. "It has come to our attention that there have been instances of disrespectful, discriminatory, and unprofessional behavior within our walls. This behavior has not only affected our staff, but has also potentially compromised the quality of care we provide to our patients." Sarah felt her heart racing as Dr. Foster spoke. She could feel the eyes of her colleagues on her, some curious, some accusatory. She resisted the urge to shrink in her seat, instead sitting up straighter, reminding herself that she had done nothing wrong by speaking the truth. "Let me be clear," Dr. Foster said, her voice taking on a steely edge. "This kind of behavior is completely unacceptable and goes against everything Piedmont Atlanta stands for. We are committed to providing the highest quality of care to our patients, and that can only happen in an environment of mutual respect, collaboration, and equality." Over the next hour, Dr. Foster, along with Mr. Thompson and other board members, outlined a series of new policies and initiatives aimed at promoting respect, diversity, and inclusion within the hospital. These included mandatory sensitivity and unconscious bias training for all staff, with additional leadership training for those in supervisory positions, the establishment of an anonymous reporting system for workplace harassment or discrimination, with guarantees of protection against retaliation, a commitment to increasing diversity in leadership positions, including the creation of a diversity and inclusion task force to oversee hiring and promotion practices, regular town hall meetings to allow staff at all levels to voice concerns and suggest improvements, a comprehensive review of patient care protocols to ensure that the input of all team members, including nurses and support staff, was being appropriately considered. As the new policies were explained, Sarah could feel the mood in the room shifting. There was a palpable sense of relief from many of her fellow nurses and support staff, who had long suffered in silence. Some of the older doctors, however, looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats and exchanging worried glances. "We want to make it clear," Dr. Foster emphasized, her gaze sweeping across the auditorium. that disrespectful or discriminatory behavior will not be tolerated at any level of our organization. Our strength lies in our diversity and in our ability to work together as a team, valuing each member's contributions, regardless of their position or background. As the meeting progressed, Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in her career, she felt truly seen and heard. The changes being proposed weren't just empty promises. They were concrete steps toward creating a more equitable workplace. Towards the end of the meeting, Mr. Thompson stepped up to the microphone. Before we conclude, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge someone whose courage and integrity were instrumental in bringing these issues to light. Nurse Sarah Johnson, would you please stand? Sarah froze, her face flushing as all eyes in the room turned to her. For a moment, she considered staying seated, the spotlight feeling too intense. But then she thought of all the others who had suffered in silence, all those who might benefit from the changes being implemented. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her legs trembling slightly. Nurse Johnson's professionalism and dedication in the face of adversity exemplify the values we should all strive to embody, Mr. Thompson continued. Her willingness to speak up has paved the way for positive change that will benefit all of us. Thank you, Sarah. The auditorium erupted in applause, and Sarah felt tears pricking at her eyes as her colleagues, nurses, doctors, and support staff alike, stood to give her a standing ovation. In that moment, she realized that her voice had made a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt marginalized or undervalued in their workplace. As the meeting adjourned, Sarah found herself surrounded by coworkers, offering congratulations and thanks. Some shared their own stories of discrimination, while others apologized for not speaking up sooner. It was overwhelming, but Sarah felt a sense of purpose she'd never experienced before. Dr. Chen approached her with a warm smile. Sarah, I've always admired your work ethic, but now I'm even more impressed by your courage. If you're interested, I'd love to have you join my team in the cardiology department. We could use someone with your insight and integrity. Overwhelmed by the support and new opportunities suddenly opening up before her, Sarah could only nod gratefully, a smile spreading across her face. As she left the auditorium that day, Sarah knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would not be easy. Change never is, but for the first time in a long time, she felt genuinely hopeful about the future of her career and her hospital. In the months that followed the hospital-wide meeting, Piedmont Atlanta underwent a remarkable transformation. The new policies were implemented swiftly and thoroughly, creating a ripple effect that touched every department and level of the organization. Sarah, now working alongside Dr. Chen in the cardiology department, found herself at the forefront of many of these changes. Her experience and insight were valued not just in patient care, but in shaping the hospital's evolving culture. One particularly impactful initiative was the mentorship program Sarah helped establish. Pairing experienced nurses with new hires and nursing students, the program aimed to provide support, guidance, and a safe space for discussing workplace challenges. Sarah took on several mentees herself, including a young Black nursing student named Tasha, who reminded Sarah of herself just a few years earlier. I can't tell you how much it means to have someone like you to look up to, Tasha told Sarah one day after shadowing her on rounds. When I was considering nursing school, so many people told me it would be too hard, that I should aim for something more realistic. But seeing you here, thriving and making a real difference, it makes me believe I can do it too. Sarah squeezed Tasha's hand, her heart swelling with pride and a sense of responsibility. You can do it, Tasha, and when things get tough, because they will, remember that you're not alone. We're building a community here, one that lifts each other up. The mentorship program wasn't the only area where Sarah's influence was felt. She also played a key role in revamping the hospital's hiring practices, advocating for more diverse interview panels, and implementing blind resume screenings to reduce unconscious bias. These efforts didn't go unnoticed. 6 months after the initial changes, Piedmont Atlanta was featured in a national healthcare journal as a model for workplace equity and inclusion. The article highlighted the hospital's innovative approaches and the positive impact on both staff morale and patient care. Sarah was interviewed for the piece, and her words resonated with healthcare workers across the country. Real change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen from the top down alone. It requires commitment at every level, a willingness to have uncomfortable conversations, and the courage to challenge long-standing norms. But when we create an environment where everyone feels valued and empowered to contribute their best, the entire community benefits. As for Dr. Hartley, he had been placed on administrative leave following the incident with Mr. Thompson. After completing a comprehensive sensitivity training program and demonstrating genuine remorse for his actions, he was allowed to return to his position, albeit with close monitoring and the understanding that any further infractions would result in immediate termination. To everyone's surprise, Dr. Hartley's return marked the beginning of a profound personal transformation. He approached Sarah on his first day back, awkwardly but sincerely apologizing for his past behavior. "Nurse Johnson, Sarah, I owe you a debt I can never fully repay," Dr. Hartley said, his voice heavy with emotion. "My behavior was inexcusable, and I'm deeply ashamed of the way I treated you and so many others over the years. I know words alone aren't enough, but I want you to know that I'm committed to changing and to being part of the solution moving forward." Sarah studied Dr. Hartley's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. To her surprise, she found none. The arrogance that had once defined his demeanor was gone, replaced by a humility she'd never seen in him before. "Thank you, Dr. Hartley," Sarah replied carefully. "I appreciate your apology. You're right that words alone aren't enough, but recognizing the need for change is an important first step. I look forward to seeing how you put that commitment into action." Over the following weeks and months, Dr. Hartley made good on his promise. He became one of the most vocal advocates for the new inclusive policies, often sharing his own story as a cautionary tale during training sessions. He made a point of publicly acknowledging the contributions of nurses and support staff, and he actively sought out diverse perspectives when making decisions about patient care. One day, nearly a year after the incident that had sparked so much change, Sarah found herself working alongside Dr. Hartley on a complex case. As they reviewed the patient's charts together, Sarah noticed something in the lab results that didn't quite add up. "Dr. Hartley," she said, "I think we might be missing something here. The patient's symptoms don't fully align with the initial diagnosis. Have you considered the possibility of—" She trailed off, half expecting to be dismissed. Instead, Dr. Hartley looked at her with genuine interest. "Go on, Sarah. What are you thinking?" Encouraged, Sarah outlined her theory. Dr. Hartley listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and building on her ideas. Together, they developed a new treatment plan that ultimately saved the patient's life. As they exited the patient's room after sharing the good news, Dr. Hartley turned to Sarah with a smile. "Excellent work, Nurse Johnson. Your insight was crucial in cracking this case. I'm fortunate to have you on my team." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, not just from the praise, but from the realization of how far they'd come. This was the collaborative, respectful working relationship she'd always dreamed of having with her colleagues. As word spread of their successful collaboration, it became a symbol of the positive changes taking place at Piedmont Atlanta. Other departments began to emulate their approach, fostering a culture of open communication and mutual respect that improved both staff satisfaction and patient outcomes. The journey wasn't always smooth. There were still instances of resistance to change, moments of tension, and occasional backsliding into old habits. But with each challenge, the hospital community grew stronger, more resilient, and more committed to their shared vision of equity and excellence. Sarah's role continued to evolve. She was invited to speak at medical conferences, sharing Piedmont Atlanta's story and inspiring other institutions to examine their own practices. She served on committees shaping hospital policy, her voice carrying weight in discussions that would have excluded her just a year earlier. As she walked the hospital corridors, Sarah often reflected on how much had changed and how much work still lay ahead. The fight for equality and respect was far from over, but she was no longer fighting alone. She had become part of a movement, a catalyst for change that was rippling out far beyond the walls of Piedmont Atlanta. and every time she mentored a young nurse like Tasha, every time she saw a diverse team collaborating seamlessly to save a life, every time she witnessed a colleague stand up against injustice, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had found her calling, not just in nursing, but in helping to shape a healthcare system that truly lived up to its highest ideals. The journey had been difficult, often painful, but as Sarah looked to the future, she felt a deep sense of hope. She had discovered a power within herself, a power to speak up, to inspire change, and to make a lasting difference in the world, and she was just getting started. 2 years after Mr. Thompson's fateful visit to Piedmont Atlanta Hospital, Sarah found herself standing in front of a packed auditorium at a national healthcare conference. As she looked out at the sea of faces, nurses, doctors, administrators, and students from all over the country, she took a deep breath, still barely able to believe she was here. The title of her presentation glowed on the screen behind her: Building a Culture of Equity and Respect in Healthcare, the Piedmont Atlanta Story. "Good morning, everyone," Sarah began, her voice strong and clear. 2 years ago, I was a nurse who felt undervalued and overlooked, despite my dedication and skills. Today, I stand before you as the newly appointed Director of Diversity and Inclusion at Piedmont Atlanta Hospital, here to share how one incident sparked a revolution in our workplace culture, and how you can create similar positive changes in your own institutions. As Sarah shared Piedmont Atlanta's journey, the challenges, the breakthroughs, and the ongoing work, she could see her words resonating with the audience. People nodded in recognition of familiar struggles, furiously took notes on successful strategies, and raised thoughtful questions during the Q&A session. One young doctor's question particularly stood out. "Ms. Johnson, your story is inspiring, but surely not every institution has a board member show up as a secret patient to catalyze change. How can we drive this kind of transformation without such a dramatic, inciting incident?" Sarah smiled, appreciating the doctor's insight. "You're absolutely right. We can't rely on chance encounters to drive necessary change. The real lesson from our experience is the power of speaking up, even when it's difficult. Each of us has the ability to be that catalyst in our own workplaces. It might not happen overnight, but persistent advocacy, coalition building, and a commitment to education and open dialogue can create a groundswell that leadership cannot ignore." She went on to share specific strategies for creating change from within, emphasizing the importance of data collection, building allies across departments, and tying diversity and inclusion efforts to improve patient outcomes and hospital performance. As the presentation concluded, Sarah was surrounded by attendees eager to continue the conversation. She noticed Dr. Hartley standing at the edge of the group, beaming with pride. He caught her eye and gave her a thumbs up, mouthing, "You nailed it." Later that evening, as Sarah was preparing to return to her hotel room, she received a text from Tasha, her former mentee. "Just heard you killed it at the conference. We're all so proud of you back here at Piedmont. You're showing the world what's possible when we refuse to be silenced. Thank you for paving the way for all of us." Sarah felt tears welling up as she read the message. She thought back to that difficult day 2 years ago, how close she'd come to giving up, to accepting that things would never change. She was profoundly grateful for Mr. Thompson's intervention, but she also recognized her own role in seizing that moment and turning it into lasting change. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Sarah's mind was already buzzing with new ideas for furthering Piedmont Atlanta's mission of inclusivity. She knew the work was far from over. Creating true equity in healthcare was an ongoing journey, not a destination. But for the first time in her career, she felt genuinely optimistic about the future. Sarah's story had become more than just a personal triumph. It was a beacon of hope for healthcare workers everywhere, a testament to the power of courage, perseverance, and the unshakable belief that every voice deserves to be heard. 5 years after the incident that changed everything, Piedmont Atlanta Hospital stood as a shining example of what healthcare institutions could achieve when they truly committed to equity and inclusion. Sarah, now the hospital's chief nursing officer, sat in her office reviewing the latest patient satisfaction scores and staff retention rates, both of which had reached record highs. A framed article on her wall featured a photo of her shaking hands with the governor, who had recently recognized Piedmont, Atlanta with a state award for workplace excellence. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Dr. Hartley entered, followed by a nervous-looking young man in scrubs. "Sarah, do you have a moment? I'd like you to meet someone." Sarah smiled warmly, gesturing for them to sit. "Of course. What can I do for you?" Dr. Hartley placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. "This is Michael, my son. He's just finished his first year of medical school, and he's hoping to do some shadowing here over the summer. I thought who better to show him the ropes than the person who taught his old man the true meaning of teamwork in healthcare." Sarah's eyebrows rose in surprise. She knew Dr. Hartley had a son, but this was the first time he'd brought him to the hospital. Michael stepped forward, extending his hand. "It's an honor to meet you, Miss Johnson. My dad has told me so much about you and the incredible changes you've helped bring about here. I was hoping I might be able to learn from you. Not just about medicine, but about how to be a truly good doctor." As Sarah shook Michael's hand, she felt the weight of the moment. Here was the next generation of healthcare professionals, eager to build on the foundation they had laid. The cycle of mentorship, respect, and positive change was continuing. "I'd be happy to show you around, Michael," Sarah said. "And please, call me Sarah. We're all part of the same team here." As the three of them left her office to begin Michael's tour, Sarah caught a glimpse of her reflection in a window. She saw not just herself, but the echoes of all those who had come before her, the nurses and doctors of color who had fought for respect and recognition, the patients who had suffered from systemic biases, the allies who had stood up and demanded change. She also saw the future. In Michael's eager eyes, in the diverse faces of the staff they passed in the halls, in the culture of mutual respect that now permeated every interaction at Piedmont, Atlanta. As they walked through the hospital, Sarah pointed out the physical changes that reflected their new philosophy, the expanded staff lounges designed to encourage interdisciplinary mingling, the prominently displayed artwork celebrating diversity, the redesigned nurses' stations that put them on equal footing with the doctors. "You see, Michael," Sarah explained, "good healthcare isn't just about medical knowledge. It's about communication, collaboration, and recognizing the value that each team member brings to the table." They stopped by a patient's room where a young nurse was giving a report to a senior doctor. Sarah smiled as she watched the doctor listening intently, asking questions, and thanking the nurse for her insights. "That's Dr. Patel and Nurse Rodriguez," Sarah told Michael. A few years ago, that interaction might have looked very different. But now, there's a genuine respect and appreciation for each other's roles. As they continued their tour, they passed by the hospital's new simulation center, where staff regularly participated in scenarios designed to improve not just their clinical skills, but also their communication and teamwork. "We found that these simulations are incredibly effective," Sarah explained. "They allow us to practice difficult conversations, confront biases in a safe environment, and learn how to advocate for our patients and each other more effectively." Michael nodded, his eyes wide with interest. "This is so different from what I've seen at other hospitals during my rotations. How did you manage to change the culture so dramatically?" Sarah exchanged a glance with Dr. Hartley before responding. "It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. It took commitment from leadership, persistence from staff at all levels, and a willingness to have uncomfortable conversations. But most importantly, it took a shared vision of what healthcare could and should be." As they approached the emergency department, Sarah turned to Michael with a smile. "Ready to see what healthcare can really be when we all work together?" Michael nodded enthusiastically, and they stepped into the bustling ER. The energy was palpable. Doctors, nurses, and support staff moving in a coordinated dance, each playing their part with precision and respect. Sarah introduced Michael to various team members, each of whom took a moment to share a bit about their role and how the hospital's changes had impacted their work. "Before, I was afraid to speak up if I noticed something off," one nurse confided. "Now, I know my observations are valued. It's made such a difference in patient care." A doctor chimed in. The collaborative atmosphere has made us all better at our jobs. I learn something new from my colleagues every day." As they wrapped up the tour, Dr. Hartley turned to his son. "So Michael, what do you think? Think you might want to do your residency here someday?" Michael's eyes shone with excitement. "Absolutely. This is the kind of place I've always dreamed of working. It's not just about treating illnesses, it's about caring for people, all people, with dignity and respect." Sarah felt a surge of pride at Michael's words. This was the future they had been working towards. A new generation of healthcare professionals who understood that true excellence in medicine required more than just technical skill. As they said their goodbyes, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The pain of that day with Dr. Hartley seemed like a lifetime ago, yet it had been the catalyst for so much positive change. She thought of Mr. Thompson, whose courage in speaking up had set everything in motion. She thought of Dr. Foster and the board, who had been willing to listen and take bold action. She thought of all the staff members who had embraced change, even when it was uncomfortable. But most of all, she thought of herself, the scared young nurse who had found the courage to stand up for what was right, who had refused to be silenced, who had dared to imagine a better future for herself and her colleagues. As Sarah walked back to her office, she passed by the hospital's mission statement, prominently displayed in the lobby. The words, which had once felt like empty rhetoric, now rang true. At Piedmont Atlanta, we are committed to providing exceptional, compassionate care to every patient, fostering a culture of respect and inclusion for all staff, and striving for continuous improvement in all that we do. Sarah smiled to herself. They had come so far, but there was still work to be done, challenges to face, battles to be fought. But now they faced them together as a united team. She sat down at her desk and pulled out a notebook. At the top of a fresh page, she wrote, "Next steps for promoting equity and inclusion in healthcare." Sarah Johnson had become more than just a nurse, more than just an administrator. She had become a symbol of what was possible when one person refused to accept the status quo, when one voice sparked a chorus of change. And as she began to jot down ideas for the future, Sarah knew that her journey, and the journey of Piedmont Atlanta Hospital, was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning.